practicing Catholic. I have a due to carry my favorite priest in America is here, Father Matt Malone of Cape Cod, and Matt's here. And we've been spending a lot of wonderful time together. And George, I just mentioned you a second ago, but thank you for being here. The genesis of this book is when I was a kid, my mother and father would take me on trips across America. We had a coachman trailer, station wagon. It was, and we would go all over. I got to visit the national parks, whether it's the Olympics up in Washington State or the Everglades in Florida or Acadia in Maine or, Perry's Memorial in Put-in-Bay, Ohio. We would go all over. And I caught the bug from doing all of that. And I should add that wherever I went, I used to pick up a brochure in those days, and it would say Theodore Roosevelt on it. I was amazed how many places TR had saved. And as president from 1901 to 1909, Theodore Roosevelt saved 234 million acres of wild America, meaning public lands. And he, with Gifford Pinchot and others of that generation, did things like create the U.S. Forest Service of today, create the idea of using the Antiquities Act of 1906 to do national monuments with an executive order. So John F. Kennedy would sign some, Kennedy had saved caves in Alabama. And, you sign, and a president can do it. TR started that with the Grand Canyon, Muir's Woods, and other places. And he created 51 federal bird reservations, which is the birth of U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Today, all of us own 550 plus national wildlife refuges. So this all began with Theodore Roosevelt. And so I call that the first wave of conservation. And why I got intrigued with TR as a boy and later wrote a book called The Wilderness Warrior about him is I had asthma as a kid. And I read in a children's biography, Theodore Roosevelt having asthma. And it just thought, wow, he overcame his asthma. And he would say, I found relief from my asthma in the natural world. He would call nature a health curative. Now, that kind of phrase gets debated by people, but as anybody knows, if you go on the waters here and go sailing or you feel this relief. And I would feel that in going out to wild places. New York City, when Theodore Roosevelt was born in 1858, was hyper polluted. I mean, the Industrial Revolution, there were no regulations. Still horses would die in the street, create sanitation problems. And so when he would go up to the Catskills and particularly the Adirondacks, he would feel healthy. So part of his passion as an environmentalist, if you like, was his belief in the spiritual value. In fact, TR would say to lose any species, no matter how small, a certain type of mouse or a lizard, is like slashing all the Rembrandts. And he loved the idea that we had a Noah's Ark approach of taking care of all of our beautiful other flora and fauna. And I would just tell you that the big book of that first wave, TR wave, was Darwin's On the Origins of Species, which came out in 1859. Now, what does that tell you? The Civil War is looming. And Theodore Roosevelt's family, his mother was from Georgia and was pro-Confederate, the Bullocks. And his father was an ardent Republican, Union man, Lincoln Grant. And they would have household feuds in New York City over the Civil War. Young TR said, with all of their fights, I decided that I was from the West. And he thought the South had overdone it with slavery, of course, and the North with industrialization that wasn't properly taking nature into consideration. And so he called the West the New Eden, and he would start having a Western vector. And when his mother and wife died on Valentine's Day, same day, historians, I was just looking at some fun things with Carrie a little while ago, but we look at other people's leavings. And to read TR's diary with an X in it, giant X saying the light's gone out of my life forever. He lost the two women and his wife on the same evening. Mother dying of Bright's disease, which is kidney failure, and his wife burned up with fever, giving birth to Alice Longworth Roosevelt, the baby. With them dead, his sister said, "Go west." He had been happiest at Harvard. He wrote his first book, Theodore Roosevelt, called The Summer Birds of the Adirondacks. And when he graduated from Harvard, he traveled out west to Western Iowa and went to Fargo, North Dakota of today, Moorhead, Minnesota, fell in love with the West. His favorite book was Francis Parkman's On the Oregon Trail, and hence became this great journey as a conservationist, environmentalist, wildlife protector. But I wrote that book on the first wave. And then I realized when I was doing that, there was a second environmental wave, which was Franklin D. Roosevelt. If you want to understand the Roosevelts, I mean, their FDR built his whole career on Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt went to Harvard. FDR goes to Harvard. Theodore Roosevelt was a state legislator in New York, FDR state legislator in New York. Theodore Roosevelt was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, FDR's Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt was governor of New York, FDR's governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt loved big Navy, naval history. FDR loved the Navy. Theodore Roosevelt loved conservation and trees. FDR loved it. And Theodore Roosevelt had a niece named Eleanor Roosevelt, and FDR married her. So when you're dealing in my realm of environmental history and presidents, the Roosevelts are giant. And FDR, many things I could tell you, but as president from 1933 to 1945, they created 800 state parks in the United States during the New Deal. In addition, Roosevelt would purposely map out flyways. He would say many of the iconic national parks of today. In fact, I live in Austin, Texas, and Big Bend National Park on the Mexican border, that got created on D-Day because Roosevelt didn't want to cancel. He met Amon Carter of Fort Worth, and they sat, and he was designing the national park, ways in and out, how to accommodate visitors on D-Day while the invasion was going on. Roosevelt loved species too. And whenever FDR wrote, The Man of the Hudson River, Eleanor Roosevelt used to say, "You want to understand my husband, his lifeblood is the Hudson River." And he knew every bit, nook, cranny, eddy, backways of Dutchess County. And always keep in mind, FDR was a upstate New York politician, not Manhattan. Dutchess County, he represented tree farmers, people in the Catskills, outdoor recreationists, orchid growers, dirt farmers. So his genius when the stock market collapsed is Roosevelt understood rural America in very real ways and how to rehabilitate land. The Civilian Conservation Corps under FDR planted 3 billion trees. Unemployed workers getting $1 a day, planting 3 billion trees because we had drained the wetlands, we had burned Dust Bowl in the prairie states, clear cut things irresponsibly. One great moment when I wrote my book Rightful Heritage about FDR is here's Roosevelt going to see the rainforest area of Washington State, and he saw a hill with trees cut. And he screams in front of the press, "Stop, everything stopped." And he started shouting over and over again, "Who did that? I hope they're roasting in hell for what they did," because it wasn't the way he grew trees. But this person out in Washington had just wiped out the whole sign, no replanting, no conservation ethics. Harold Ickes, I thought, was the greatest Secretary of Interior until I'm going to tell you about Stuart Udall in a minute over Kennedy and Johnson. But that was the second wave. My book, Silent Spring Revolution, which is right there in your hands. Silent Spring Revolution is the third wave of environmental movement in the United States. And it doesn't have a Roosevelt. It's mainly about how Kennedy, Johnson, and an activist, Rachel Carson, and Stuart Udall were able to launch an environmental movement that we're all living with today that was extraordinary. I just did MSNBC a moment ago and with talking about Hawaii and climate. We're on the cusp of a fourth wave. We're waiting for it. It's big, it's climate, it's global, but it's going to take the people to rise up and put environmentalism on the very top of the national agenda. And I think we're getting near that tipping point now. What happened in this third wave, though, really begins in 1945, because when the bombs went off at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but particularly that first Hiroshima bomb, people were shocked. And some of the leading, everybody was glad the war is going to be over, we won. But what does the bomb mean for life, human life? Animal, are we doomed to blow up the planet? And there were people that were raising red flags that this is dangerous. One of them was a man named Norman Cousins, editor of Saturday Review, which wrote a book that Jack Kennedy loved called Is Man Obsolete? It started as a quick article. It was really the first big questioning of what the nuclear age means. And Cousins was saying, how do we regulate this? How do we stop other countries from getting the bomb? What does it mean? Is it moral? Is it not moral? What does it mean, Father, from a spiritual way? You know, what does this mean, the atomic bomb? And Cousins became a favorite of John F. Kennedy. And in the 1950s, Cousins he created a group called SANE, SANE, to stop nuclear testing. Because after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we detonated 1,054 nuclear bombs in the United States, testing in the Cold War. 1,054. We were blowing them up willy-nilly in Nevada. People in Nevada didn't mind back then. They were, in fact, Vegas, they would say, atomic cocktails and, do the nuclear boogie. And they're selling the snow globes with white fallout coming out of it. And Nevada felt they were at the cutting edge of modernity and winning the Cold War. But there were huge health concerns about those nuclear fallout and how it blew and made people sick in the 50s. And Norman Cousins was the leading voice. And there were others he had working at his side. Coretta Scott King was saying, Coretta would picket everywhere, go to Geneva, saying Russia, Britain, and the United States must stop testing nuclear weapons. And Norman Cousins plays a major role in history for Kerry with John F. Kennedy, because Kennedy loved his reviews. Was skeptical of nuclear testing. It was hard to get rid of it in the Cold War environment. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy got a hold of Norman Cousins and said, Norman, you're going to be my secret envoy. And he first dispatched Cousins, unbeknownst to press, media, anybody, just to go to the Vatican and meet the Pope. Cousins met the Pope and then quietly found a way to meet Khrushchev at his dacha in the summer home and have a private meeting representing John F. Kennedy with Khrushchev, with the idea of we are serious about the needs to stop nuclear testing. The president's serious. And I'm here. When I get back, I'll be reporting to him. We're keeping it out of State Department chain, keeping it out of CIA. We're keeping it out of Department of Defense. This is what we call track 2 diplomacy, back channel through Norman Cousins. And Kennedy went with it. In a famous American University speech for peace, he launches the idea of stopping and then is able to sell to the Senate the banning of testing of nuclear weapons. One of the great things, Ted Sorensen, Kennedy's great aide and friend, said it's the greatest thing that John F. Kennedy was most proud of is stopping this these nuclear tests. He got the treaty done with Britain, the United States, and Russia. And most people see it as a thaw in the Cold War, taking the temperature down, and which is true, but it's also, as Barry Commoner, a great environmentalist, called the greatest ecological act ever, to suddenly go from that to nothing. Okay. And in another person that was skeptical of atomic testing was, and this will surprise you because it surprised me, was John F. Kennedy's father. Joseph Kennedy, after Hiroshima, was horrified that the bomb hit a civilian population and got a hold of Henry Luce, a New York bishop, and was trying to make sure it wasn't used again. And so when you're seeing John F. Kennedy's worry about it, some of that comes from his father. You can't equate how much, but it's a side of Joseph Kennedy most people don't see, that he was very concerned about nuclear testing and using these bombs as a weapon in military. And then the other big person was Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson and John F. Kennedy's lives intertwine in a very dramatic way. Rachel Carson was born in Western Pennsylvania, Springdale, and she lived along the Allegheny River, which was so polluted, glue factories and smudged air and bad health. But she felt that was a tragedy. She didn't have her backyard river, but she became a budding naturalist, collected birds' nests and learned leaves and species, loved the animal life. She got her first article published as a girl in St. Nicholas magazine, which was a big deal. And she found a mentor when she went to Chapman's Women's College. Professor Skinner noticed her. I was thinking of you, Nina, a little bit ago, talking to you, that she had both an ability to write well, Rachel Carson, the humanities, liberal arts, creative writing, but great at science. And she convinced Rachel Carson that you morph those and you can be something special. Rachel Carson never saw the ocean before, and she came to study here at Woods Hole. And it was at Woods Hole that her love affair with the ocean began. She started writing about sea urchins, shoreline conservation. She'd go out with trawlers, and she then later would go do her advanced degree in zoology at Johns Hopkins and would write for the Baltimore Sun. But the big thing that was her first interest were eels. Because migratory birds, and remember, and you're dealing in, let's just say it, 1930s America during the Depression, we weren't doing bird banning and DNA and, radar and all of this, but there was a great literature being built on bird migrations. Nobody was writing on eels. And she couldn't believe an eel can make the journey from Africa all the way to a river in Pennsylvania. So she started doing really sophisticated eel research. World War II kicks in, like she wants to serve our country, and she gets hired to be really head of publications for U.S. Fish and Wildlife, working for FDR, who was her hero, and Eleanor Roosevelt, her hero. And she would write radio scripts during World War II and started writing book pamphlets called Conservation in Action. So it was like a WPA guide for a wildlife refuge. She wrote a handful of them herself, and she'd give assignments, and it always was to inventory these. She was just brilliant. And then she wrote in 1941 her first book. If you have one assignment for me tonight, it's to read one of Rachel Carson's 3 books on the ocean. They're glorious books, beautifully written, holds up today. They're classics. And she started doing ocean conservation and ocean writing. Only Jacques Cousteau and Sylvia Earle are kind of in her realm, but nobody wrote about sea life better than Rachel Carson. And her love beyond Cape Cod was the coast of Maine. She would spend much time there as she could. She even went underwater down in my University of Miami to go have an underwater experience. She wrote mainly for the Atlantic and then the New Yorker. But so she was very content being an ocean writer. And you know who Rachel Carson's biggest fan was? Rose Kennedy. Rose Kennedy, although so associated with here, meaning Massachusetts, in the shoreline or Boston, had spent childhood in Concord. And she fell in love with Henry David Thoreau. And not just Walden, but she would swim in Walden Pond. She took some of the Kennedys swimming in Walden Pond. It was almost a ritual, but she would memorize passages of Henry David Thoreau. And Henry Betson here, who did The Outermost House about Cape Cod, came out in 1928, she loved. But I mean, really loved this idea of seashore conservation. She was a Thoreauvian. And remember, Thoreau also wrote the essays on civil disobedience that Martin Luther King, there are a lot of Henry David Thoreau's, a great figure. But it was so important that she once went to Russia and collaborated with the CIA to look and find out if the collected works of Thoreau were being carried in the Russian libraries, because she wanted to make sure his works were all there. And that in that mid-1950s, so you've got the anti-nuclear testing group lane, and then the seashore preservation lane, and John F. Kennedy falls in with both, but he falls in with the seashore preservation group because William O. Douglas, the great Supreme Court justice, when the mid-1950s hiked the entire 186 miles of the C&O Canal and saved a road from being built that would have gone from Georgetown to Potomac, Maryland, and had people hiking with them. Recently saw a letter. And so the Kennedy family adopted William O. Douglas. Joseph Kennedy said, "I don't know what's wrong with me. I disagree with so many of your political views, but my two favorite people in public life are my son Jack and Bill Douglas." Bill Douglas hired William O. Douglas, had been from Yakima, Washington, grew up poor, went to Whitman College, hoboed, hitchhiked to New York, Columbia Law grad, and became a legal, amazing justice. When you guys deal with issues about FDR packing the Supreme Court, if you remember, we have 9 Supreme Court justices. Roosevelt wanted to add 6 to make it because they were stopping his New Deal legislation. He got shot down, FDR. He got his revenge putting Bill Douglas, the youngest Supreme Court justice ever and the longest serving term. Bill Douglas was an ardent, I underline ardent, wilderness explorer, outdoor adventurer, mountain climber, vigorous life person. And Douglas in the 50s influenced both Bobby Kennedy, your father, and influenced mightily Jack Kennedy, both different ways. With Jack, who he was much closer to Bobby or Robert Kennedy, because Bobby Kennedy took to the natural world, the trails, just loved it. He used to say to Jack, you got to adopt a conservation party senator. The problem is with you, Jack, you haven't slept on the ground enough. And you've got to, and well, the truth was he had a horrible back, John F. Kennedy, and that kind of hiking that Douglas is talking about would not be possible in those ways. But JFK wasn't wearing that on his sleeve like that. But they agreed, and seashore preservation became Jack Kennedy's big conservation movement. Rose Kennedy loved it. And the Kennedy family get a lot of credit, a lion's share of it, in my mind, for saving of Cape Cod National Seashore here at Cape Cod. Kennedy pushed it through right away in 1961, but he began the campaign as a senator because Douglas brought to his attention a government report called Our Vanishing Seashores, where there were no public beaches. Everything was being Jerseyized, built upon, and that there was a need for these public lands. I will tell you, when you do environmental history, it is, and you're a president, it's easy to save rock in Alaska, meaning the Brooks Range. And you can log a lot of acreage on your watch. We saved 2.5 million acres of the mountain of the Brooks Range. Try saving high-priced coastal real estate. Try doing Cape Cod National Seashore, which Kennedy did as president. Padre Island in Texas, if you look at a map, you'll see how big it is. Point Reyes, that's Marin County, right off the Golden Gate Bridge. Kennedy went after those kind of seashore preservation and created a whole new category of what they call seashore lakeshore preservation. So even after he's killed in Dallas, JFK's plan on all of this continued with Stuart Udall, Secretary of Interior, and they ended up saving Apostle Islands up in Wisconsin, 22 islands, Sleeping Bear Dunes up in northern Michigan, Picture Rock up in Michigan, Indiana Dunes, Fire Island National Seashore in New York, Cumberland National Seashore in Georgia, Assateague in Maryland and Virginia, and more. It was another movement based on Rachel Carson, bringing seashore conservation to people's attention, the power of Thoreau as translated through the Kennedy family, and Bill Douglas coaching it along. Bobby Kennedy got into the vigorous life with William O. Douglas. In fact, he went hiking with Bill Douglas all through Siberia. Siberia is not an easy place to go. That in the middle of the Cold War, there's Bill Douglas and Bobby Kennedy on the hiking around. And at one point, Ethel Kennedy, your mom, wasn't very happy because Bill Douglas, Bobby got a fever, and he was a Darwinian man, he's a survival outdoor. I mean, real endurance guy, Bill Douglas. And Bobby's in a fever in a lost village, like up in the middle of the Siberia, and burning with fever. They're trying to get antibiotics for him and medicine. And Bill Douglas grabs his backpack. And so, Bobby, this is where we part. He left him there. So left him in Siberia. And so you can imagine Ethel Kennedy was livid. You left my husband there with the fever in the middle of the thing. But Bobby never took it badly, never held it against Bill Douglas. It was sort of a code of go onward, and this sort of thing. But they would go, Ethel and Bobby Kennedy, her parents, would go on protest hikes with the Douglas, leading like to stop a road in an Olympic Peninsula in Washington, or they'd go with many of the Kennedys go on the hikes and through Maryland and Virginia with Bill Douglas, and he was like a ultimate leader on all of that. And of course, Douglas is one of the progenitors of the idea of the Peace Corps, the Kennedy family, deeply intertwined. There was no EPA in let's say Kennedy's presidency, right? We have no EPA, no Clean Air Act, no Clean Water Act, no national sewage things. It was William O. Douglas's desk that became a clearinghouse. If you had an environmental issue, somebody here, some of you from grassroots conservation groups, thank you for sponsoring me tonight. If you had an issue on water quality up here, something, if you would write Bill Douglas, and if it got on his desk, he would find people to attack the problem. So he never lost his protest. He stopped a dam at the Buffalo River in Arkansas, hiking one of the most beautiful rivers. He did it with the painter Thomas Hart Benton, who wanted to save it. He'd go to with Wendell Berry, a great agrarian writer alive today, working with the Sierra Club as Supreme Court Justice to stop a dam in Kentucky. He stopped one in Illinois. We were doing civil rights protests, but he was doing nature walks, hike protests for nature. When Kennedy becomes in 1960, it's the key year. In truth, these currents I'm writing about were going on, as I said, from 45 to 60, but it's Kennedy's presidency that changed it. It's the beginning of the third wave because he allowed all of these Wilderness Society or Audubon people, on and on into the White House. And he held a huge White House Conservation Conference. Started making the environmental movements born during the Kennedy years as president. And the big moment that changed things beyond the preservation and all was Rachel Carson. In the late 50s, Rachel Carson started seeing that DDT was killing species. DDT, when John F. Kennedy was in the Pacific, PT-109, you'd want to be sprayed with it. All of us would. It killed lice, mosquitoes, stopped malarial diseases. It was a new chemical that was, almost like a miracle in our win the war cause. But by hurry up to win World War II, we did not regulate it. And so after the war, farmers adopted DDT. It wasn't figured out how much to use, how much to apply. So crop planes would just dump the stuff all over the place. And it created cancer clusters and started wiping out wildlife. In Georgia, this October 1, Jimmy Carter will be 99 years old. Hospice, longest living president. Do you realize Jimmy Carter's mother died of pancreatic cancer? His father died of pancreatic cancer. His brother Billy died of pancreatic cancer. His sister Ruth died of pancreatic cancer. His sister Gloria died of pancreatic cancer because they were spraying the stuff all over the peanut and cotton fields. Carter had gone to the Naval Academy, President Carter, and had gone around the world, so he wasn't there for the big sprayings. But if you go there, you'll find it's a pancreatic cancer hotspot. Just like in Nevada and Arizona, you will find the people sick from fallout and what happened to families from being anywhere near all of those tests. The Rachel Carson got a bunch of data from U.S. Fish and Wildlife whistleblowers showing at their test in Patuxent, Maryland, FDR created Patuxent as our National Wildlife Research Center. But what it does there, we put a chemical in a stream there and see how it affects the fish. See how it affects a robin. It's where we're testing what our planet can take. And she got that information, but got and added it with a legal suit. Do any of you remember Marjorie? I'm sorry. Any of you remember Dr. Benjamin Spock? Spock's sister, the baby doctor's sister, Marjorie, lived in Suffolk County out towards the Hamptons, but had a massive farm that was organic. Now, today, we're also used to organic. We're Whole Foods America, and, people talk about organic. But it was a little unusual. She was going pure organic farming, and she sues Suffolk County Mosquito Control, USDA, for taking away her right to be an organic farmer because these planes were dropping pesticides, DDT, on her crops. And it was a big case. It works its way to the Supreme Court. And Marjorie Spock loses her Supreme Court case. But Bill Douglas writes a biting dissent. It gets published in Reader's Digest. It's brilliant, defending her and that she has a constitutional right to the air above her property. And you can see if you have a legal, what do we own above our houses? And, had a lot of things going on. Marjorie Spock lost, had Douglas backing her, and then gave all of that court documents to Rachel Carson. And Carson is diagnosed with breast cancer. She goes to Mayo Clinic, Cleveland Clinic, and it just metastasizes. And she's a race against death. She finishes her book, Silent Spring, which is a condemnation of the chemical pesticide manufacturers in America. And it comes out in the New Yorker in the spring, the first excerpt, spring of 62. And then John F. Kennedy, at one of those great press conferences, is throwing a question, what about Carson and her, new findings? And he said, I'm going to did the exact thing. I know about Ms. Carson's work, and we're going to put a scientific panel together and investigate what she's saying. He found the best scientists, Harvard, MIT, ACE Group. They came out with their report that Carson was indeed correct, that pesticides was white thinning the eggs. That's why eagles were disappearing. That's why falcons were disappearing, particularly raptors, but fish species. And it was a holocaust on the natural environment, what we are doing with DDT. And so that moment when Kennedy did that and backed her, it's like very rarely happens in presidential history. It's like, the impact. It's like when, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin and Lincoln reads it, or Theodore Roosevelt reads Upton Sinclair's The Jungle about the meatpacking industries of Chicago. This book, when it came out in 62, did something novel. It told, there were some of you here that may have been Rooseveltian conservationists. I want to save some of the shoreline. I want this. But Rachel Carson is saying your kids are getting sick. Your kids are getting sick. Your children, grandchildren playing in the backyard. If they swim in the river, they're getting contaminated. There's a cancer spread through to these pesticides, and it's affecting you and you and you. That blows it up. Conservation isn't anymore saving of a monument in Utah or something. It's public health. She marries public health and the environment with old style conservation. And she testifies. She goes on CBS. She's brilliant. And John F. Kennedy's dead in November of 1963. Rachel Carson dies shortly after in 64. But it's that combo there that put the word the beginning of environment replacing conservation. It took 10 years to ban DDT. 62 was her book, and it finally gets banned in 1972 by Nixon's EPA head, William Ruckelshaus. And that years in between, those years are called the DDT Wars. And this is the birth of today's modern environmental groups. The first one that gets the credit is a group called the Environmental Defense Fund. They're founded out of Stony Brook. They're a group of lawyers, professors, bankers, financial people, local citizens came together, and they created the slogan, "Sue the Bastards." And they started aiming at where DDT was being applied and creating suits. So if they were spraying it in Dartmouth, Hanover became a war spot, Princeton campus. At Princeton, all the robins were dropping dead. Ralph Nader's first thing into public life became watching the birds die around Princeton. They would go and sue Madison, Wisconsin for using DDT to kill insects. And eventually it works because a lot of cities are like, can't we use something besides DDT? I don't want to be sued. There must be some other way to do this. So it started it. And then all of them begin. Environmental law today is ubiquitous. It was born at the desk of William O. Douglas, and it got actuated by the year 1967 with Environmental Defense Fund. And it came home in earnest in 1970 with the birth of when Nixon on January 170 at San Clemente creates NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, which makes mandatory environmental impact statements. You can't go build without writing how's it affecting the environment? How's it affecting the wetlands? How's it affecting species? And that gives birth to environmental law, because suddenly you're not just working for the Forest Service or, outdoor recreation industry. You're getting Exxon has environmental lawyers, and, Monsanto has environmental lawyers, and everybody has to have an environmental lawyer. One of the successes of the Kennedy-Johnson years is this birth of environmental law, which now is at every law school in the country, and it starts there. Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, I'll just say about RFK because Carrie's here. I mean, her father then started getting really into conservation and the environment. He would climb the tallest mountain in Mount Kennedy in Canada, and he'd take the family and river trips. Carrie over the years told me about going through that rivers in Idaho and the Grand Canyon, where she had a dog like that. And, but they would go on these great family river trips. Now, at first it's like, how great, family doing a river trip. But what you're not being, fully maybe known beyond, because the photos are so wonderful and all these incredible people would come along with the Kennedy family for some of these river runs. But it saved a consciousness, like in the Grand Canyon at the time, they were going to build a dam that would have ruined the Grand Canyon. So it became a way to showing the river run and give support for what becomes the bill circulating around the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And it gets signed. Robert F. Kennedy's a huge promoter of it, meaning before his son, Robert Kennedy Jr., worked the Hudson, RFK, his father, was doing scenic Hudson preservation, kayaking, opening up outdoor river recreation, and doing away with some of these dams that weren't necessary. Johnson and Udall eventually stopped the dam in the Grand Canyon. Frank Church, great friend of the Kennedy families in Idaho, start there, and then they'll save that river. And one of Johnson's great accomplishments is Wild and Scenic Rivers. And for LBJ, let me say this, since I mentioned Thoreau and Rose Kennedy. All of you here, I can ask you, and maybe when we're signing, what is your Walden Pond? What place in the natural world has touched you the most, that when you reflect on your life that you say, God, my whole life, this place is so special to me? I just think of my grandmother's farm, or, the beach here, or, but there's some place. Kennedy, JFK's was Cape Cod and the Atlantic seaboard, from Palm Beach to here. He had what we call blue mind. He could not wait to get out on a boat and let all the pressure drop. And it's called blue mind. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis, he's drawing sailboat doodles, and and LBJ and Lady Bird. It was the Pedernales River in Texas Hill Country. It's a beautiful river, the Pedernales, gorgeous. And they found so it's odd because Lyndon began his career wanting funding for every dam known to man. Port for my district. It was the Democratic Party tradition, from FDR doing Grand Coulee Dam and, Tennessee Valley Authority. And thank God FDR did that. We needed the electricity. We needed those dams, but it was starting to get abused. And some places had to be considered whether a dam was needed or not. Do we really need the dam? And it's going to ruin the river. What are the scenic, recreational, historic resources? How is it affecting local ecology? Let's only do dams when they're really needed, not just because the congressman wants a bunch of money for his district. And LBJ flipped on that issue. By 1968, he had become an ardent person on wild and scenic rivers. He created LBJ, the National Trail System, the Appalachian Trail, Pacific Crest Trail. He created new national parks with Stuart Udall, like Canyonlands in Utah and North Cascades in Washington. Lady Bird is synonymous with, as you know, with nature, anti-billboards, pick up garbage, recycling. She's known as First Lady, as the environmental First Lady, and I could talk about her a long time. But and then they die. He doesn't run in 1968, and in 1968, Robert F. Kennedy is murdered. He was a leading voice in the natural preservation world, and Johnson's not running anymore. Hubert Humphrey showed a little interest in Wilderness Act up in Minnesota, roadless nature. But to cut to the chase, Nixon wins in 1968. And when Nixon wins, environmentalists are like, oh my God. He has no interest in any of this stuff, water quality, air quality. But Nixon's only president 8 days, and something unusual happened. Just barely can get in the desk in the White House, and the Santa Barbara oil spill happens. Paradise, Santa Barbara, goo all over the beach. The grassroots group is goo, get the oil out of Santa Barbara. It's no longer, a lot of Republicans in California that knew Nixon did not want their backyards on the ocean polluted with oil. And Nixon, to his credit, had picked John Ehrlichman, who for going to prison for Watergate. Nixon had such a dislike of environmental issues, but Ehrlichman was an environmental lawyer from Seattle. He did public land and water uses. He would represent NIMBY groups. If you here had an aluminum plant being built and people say, no, it's scenic Cape Cod, we're not doing that plant there, you'd hire Ehrlichman. And Nixon countered him in the early 1960s. And so when 1968 environmentalism was in the air, he told Ehrlichman, you deal with all that. I'm about foreign affairs, military affairs. I'm into other issues. You run the ball on it. Ehrlichman and Nixon start doing a lot of things. After Santa Barbara, Nixon rightfully denounced the disaster, did the right motions. That summer of 1969, while Nixon's watching Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the moon, you're getting the Cuyahoga River of Ohio on fire, the Rouge River on fire. Then in the fall of 1969, Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin, an ardent environmentalist, catches the idea of Earth Day. And the first Earth Day is scheduled for April 22nd, 1970. And Nixon now goes paranoid. I'm getting killed on the environment. I'm going to have to up my game. He thought Ed Muskie was going to be the Democratic nominee in 1972 and not George McGovern. And Muskie was all over as Mr. Clean Air Act, clean water. And he hated Nixon. And a man who keeps an enemies list Nixon, his number one person he despised was Muskie, because Muskie daily would denounce Nixon's Vietnam policy. Anything Nixon did, Muskie denounced, called him a polluter, didn't care about the natural world, and it infuriated Nixon. So his first response to this looming Earth Day is to sign NEPA that I mentioned, and made the deal. I'll sign it if Scoop Jackson of Washington, Senator, and Dingell of Michigan are the Democrats, but Muskie's not to be at any White House ceremony. I don't want to see his face. Truly, it's in writing. No, I don't. If he gets any credit, I'm cutting off. And he held grudges, Nixon. And then when he gave he gave 2/3 of his first 1970 State of the Unions on the environment, Nixon. But Earth Day started bothering Nixon. He saw it as a trap of the anti-Vietnam War movement. And Nixon asked the seminal question for Ehrlichman to find: who's funding Earth Day? Where's this money coming from? How are all these campuses having these Earth Day offices popping up like mushrooms, toadstools everywhere? And it came down, Carrie, to somebody we talked about this morning. Walter Reuther of the United Automobile Workers was paying the bills for the first Earth Day, because Reuther believed environment and labor had to work together, environmentalists and labor. And Reuther said blue-collar workers cannot travel to Grand Canyon. They don't have that extra money to do it. We need local rivers, local parks, local in Flint, Ypsilanti, Greater Detroit, Dearborn. And so he was ardent on the environment. And he, incidentally, his plane crashed mysteriously, and his wife, Reuther, and in May, Reuther died days after Earth Day, that first Earth Day. But Nixon then is trying to strategize in one of his memos, and you can't believe a guy would write this as president, but he's like, I'm worried it's a pinko communist plot, Earth Day. He uses that phrase. But he's figuring out, how do I play my Earth Day card? So in a perfect suit with Pat Nixon, they plant a tree on the White House. So you get the photo. I'm in the spirit, planting a tree. He gave Interior Department employees off to go talk about the Earth Day, teach ecology for the day. But he put the FBI on all of the environmental groups and wanted detailed surveillance of all of these guys like Dennis Hayes, the student leader. And one of the funnier things I've read as a historian is when a Republican Congressman, Pete McCloskey of California, who is an environmental guy, and Ehrlichman, who's an environmental guy, are writing, and Ehrlichman is saying, you guys had no idea what it was like. I had to tell Nixon the report of the surveillance came in, and there was nothing happened except some making out, some Frisbees, a little pot. There was nothing subversive. It was just wholesome. No violence, no event. I mean, really, for that large a protest, it's quite remarkable. And all these artists contributed to that first Earth Day. If you guys remember, Robert Rauschenberg did the original Earth Day poster. Later, Andy Warhol did all the endangered species posters. Music coming out of that era, Marvin Gaye, Mercy Me, The Ecology, and Pete Seeger doing a sloop and Clean the Hudson River, the great folk singer. And, Joni Mitchell in Hawaii wrote the song that paved, they were in, paradise and put up a parking lot. Guys like Neil Young and all these people are getting in environmental music. Whale song was being recorded for the first time, and there became a Save the Whale movement. All this is going on. But Nixon, to his credit, got through Earth Day and said, well, we're going to create the Environmental Protection Agency. And the EPA is created with Ehrlichman, Nixon, and Scoop Jackson, Dingell in 1970, the summer, and it opens its doors in December 1970. And we had a great public servant, Republican from Indiana, William Ruckelshaus, as our first. Ruckelshaus was ardent on busting the people weren't following federal law. Because what you got to see about EPA when it opened its doors, it's like, think of the Brown versus Topeka decision on civil rights. What was the Brown decision? Okay, separate, but we're throwing out Plessy versus Ferguson. No more segregation in schools. But what is the whole movement? people not complying to Brown, right? I mean, you go to Little Rock, 1957, they're not complying to Brown. You know, Ruby Bridges, New Orleans, they're not complying to Brown. Well, EPA created in 1970, a bunch of companies weren't following the federal guidelines. And Ruckels had to make examples of huge corporate polluters that were refusing to follow the new rigorous EPA standards. And it started the EPA being hated by the oil and gas petroleum industries as a hyper regulator cop on who's polluting. And by telling you that Nixon went on and beyond the Clean Air Act of 1971, Clean Water Act of 72, that Endangered Species Act of 73, anything you can do to keep it strong. There's a movement now to undo it. And it brought back our bald eagles, it brought back our falcons, it brought back the manatee, it brought back the alligator. It was a great success. I was in Australia in June, and they've modeled their endangered species after our act. But our current Republican Party wants to undo Nixon. You know, they want to undo the EPA standards. They want to undo the Clean Air Act. It's not just Johnson and Kennedy. They want to undo what Nixon had done in that period. And so it's a rollback time. And so we have to keep our eyes on all of this. Nixon, my book ends 1973 for the reason that that's when the revolution ended, meaning that progressive movement of Kennedy and Johnson, which forced Nixon to get into it too, had ended with the Arab oil embargo of 73, because the oil companies and started organizing in OPEC and the boycott of Arab countries. Gas prices went up. You know, double-digit inflation, high gas prices. And then the big question was, did the environmentalists go too far? And since then, it's been tough. By 1980, when Reagan wins and beats Carter, we lost in the Senate environmental senators. They all left. George McGovern lost, and Gaylord Nelson lost, and Frank Church lost. And those activist senators that put the environment top started disappearing. And meanwhile, there's a thing called the Powell Memo by Lewis Powell that was developed to counter William O. Douglas in the Supreme Court. They're a great dual biography, Powell and Douglas. Powell represented the tobacco industry from Virginia and wrote this incredible missive to all the Chamber of Commerces that the liberals, the Greens, the environmentalists, the people that want to regulate industry have had win after win after win after win with Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And for us to roll that back is going to take 30 or 40 years. And we have to create our own television networks. We have to create our own talking points. This is the birth of the Federalist Society, American Enterprise, Cato, Koch brothers, Scaife brothers. It's a counter-revolution to the Carson Revolution. And that's what we're living in right now, guys. We're fighting this out as I speak, and yet climate is going to take all hands on deck. And I'll end by telling you, today in Montana, I don't know if you saw it, but pull up a story. A group of young people have sued that they have a birthright to clean air and clean water, and the judge agreed with them. And that because fossil fuel emissions contributing to their lower health quality. And so now this is starting to become a big legal issue. William O. Douglas convinced John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson to be behind a wilderness Bill of Rights. Which may not have been the right word, wilderness. I love it for that. But what he was arguing, Douglas, is that one of our birthrights should be we have a right to clean air and clean water, and that we shouldn't be able to be sick due to environmental degradation. That's as much as free speech or Gunn's Second Amendment, that we should have a American right to living without toxic debris. And some of my book, I deal with environmental justice issues where people like Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, and others with the Farm Workers Union started fighting against DDT because it was causing deformed babies. And Martin Luther King died in a sanitation fight. The Black Caucus gets created in 1971, and they start turning at urban environmental issues. Why does the toxic debris always get placed on people of color? Coretta Scott King was part of that. Coretta loved the natural world. Nobody knows that about her. When Martin Luther King was killed, she took her family into New Hampshire and stayed on a lake and would go there as often as she could away. She found great solace, but everybody thinks of her so urban, but she loved being in the natural world, Coretta. So there are a lot of things to discover in this period. But alas, I'm a historian, and we're in a new era right now. And I'm watching what's been going on this summer with the burning heat. I don't think you can be a climate denier anymore. I think you have to find ways that we mitigate and move forward, but it's here, it's upon us, and we're going to need an activist citizenry to start doing the massive kind of reforms that we need. Thank you, guys.
Do you have time for a few questions? Before we do that, though, I want to make sure I get you your JFK socks. You may never need them again with climate change, but you know, you can be very stylish. Thank you, Dr. Brinkley. That was amazing. So we've had quite a robust presentation here. I'm sure some of you have questions. And George Regan.
Great presentation. Do you think our leadership for Democrat Republican and a party is capable of handling the situation we now find ourselves in?
No. It's turning to be part of the problem is we don't have, when the Endangered Species Act, I'm fond of reminding people when that's that 92-0, it passes in the Senate. So it became the American people demanding clean air, clean water, and now we're divided. So I think you're seeing a lot more happening on state levels. For example, California and Washington are saying by 2030, we're not selling fossil fuel in our state. And that will spread because if more states take that, Ford Motor, Toyota are going to say, we don't need to run on gasoline. We're a car company. They're already trying to do that now. And it's going to be tough, but that you'll see some of that. I also think there are great success stories going on in wind and solar right now that are remarkable. The indicators are great with alternative energies. We're moving faster in that direction than possible. But I'm afraid it's as long as both parties don't want to come to the table. If one party is seeing climate as a hoax or something being deeply exaggerated, for the other party, it's going to be hard to get together on big new federal. And then we have the problem of the global aspect of this. And to be fair to the Republicans who constantly bring up the very true and great point, I mean, China's just having their industrial revolution and using more coal-fired plants than ever before. So we might phase it out while they're amping it up. But we need to be the innovator. We need the moonshots I do believe in American capitalism and our business and research that we can do, find new ways. At some point, we're going to get there, but it's late. It's not a warning anymore. We're in it. You're in the opening salvo of the age of climate. It's an age of mass extinction. It's going to have problems after problems. And in certain places, I look all the time on where is livable in the next 50 years and where is going to be hard to live due to wildfires, flooding, coastal areas. I wrote the book on Hurricane Katrina called The Great Deluge on Katrina and Mississippi, Louisiana. And I was very careful not to call that a climate emergency because you can't prove a hurricane, really. I mean, a hurricane hits, was it a climate hurricane? And I didn't want to be seen as an activist. I'm a historian. I'm tired of being just the historian. I promise you now, these are climate related, what were happening this summer, the wildfires in Europe and wildfires in Canada and what's going on with the melting glaciers. And so we can't pretend, play ostrich, play games anymore. But the answer, get out and vote. Get out there, get young kids mobilized and vote, vote, vote. It's all going to be about young people who rank climate. Most of us put it at fourth or fifth, older people, but for young people, it's their top issue, and mobilize them. They've got to get out there and lead now because we've screwed up. I was heartbroken. I did not, unfortunately, get to talk about Stuart Udall today, the Interior Secretary, and his son, Tom, is our ambassador in New Zealand. Just an amazing story, the whole Udall family. But Mark Udall was a senator from Colorado and had like a perfect record on conservation and environment, and he lost a Senate seat by an inch. It's in the margins right now. And so we've got to put candidates that want to be climate warriors. And I did MSNBC a little bit ago and starting to tell Biden, who's done his package on climate a year ago, infrastructure, remarkable in a lot of ways for getting it done. But we need to start calling climate emergencies and not be wanting to carefully curate our language and all anymore. But you have to, I tell kids, stay hopeful. I do not want a dreary kid in my class. They can't, there's too many of these conservation groups. Who's here from a conservation group? Which do you work for? So I tell a young person, join the Barnstable Land Trust, right? You need workers, volunteer, join, get the newsletter. You might only be able to do one thing a week, but you have a heart that cares about stewardship and the planet. Don't get discouraged, join a group, because eventually it'll all come together in this, what I'm calling a fourth wave movement. But don't lose the young people now because they're in existential angst about climate disaster. And it's psychologically they are. And so embrace their love. They have a great love of the natural. Anybody who gets involved with conservation loves God, loves stewardship, loves spiritual renewal, and those are special people and we don't want to lose them. Thank you.
There's sort of a population bomb in Africa, particularly South America, and then you have large parts of the habitable world being consumed by rising sea levels and climate change, forest fires, and so on. It seems like there's something bad coming.
Book of Revelations coming to. No, I understand, and we're all living that, and it's true. But then you have to ask yourselves, what do we do? And we're going to have to make American leadership. We are still the leader of the world, and we're going to have to do it here. And we're dysfunctional now when we have our public not trusting Congress, Supreme Court, journalism. I find on the local level, things are a lot better in America. I think our corporate structure, we have amazing companies. And I think our universities and colleges have a lot of strengths. And we do own these parks and wildlife refuge. We did a lot, but we can't start sliding backwards and unraveling Clean Air and Clean Water Acts at the time of crisis. So it's a kind of all hands on deck to try to save the planet. And it's why Greta was so popular with young people. She was an opening voice of a new generation that may be prioritizing this. Generation Z or whatever may be the answer. We have to hope that they're able to rectify our blunders. We've had the ability to address this, but we don't have the political will.
As a veteran of 40 years of fighting battles on the Endangered Species Act, both in Congress and as an NGO, I'm always intrigued by Richard Nixon's role in it. And I find that part of your talk fascinating. Do you think, putting the historian and the activist together, there's a budding JFK, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon trio in Washington today to be pulled out?
Wow. Well, you have to believe that. I don't know who that person or people are. We're looking for a leader. And, unfortunately, I did the interviews for Barack Obama's oral history at Columbia on the people and the environment. They have a big oral history project. So I got to talk to them and do the oral histories. And no president since Jimmy Carter, put solar panels on the White House, has had an ability to prioritize climate the way they'd like. It's just tough. I mean, it's like going against on guns. It's tough. It's very tough on it. And Obama wanted to be the big climate president, and Biden does, but Biden's got to win. So he's got to deal with West Virginia and Joe Manchin and how do I, not lose, he's, and so it's a hard political calculus right now because it's not a people's movement. It's a lot, but it's starting to become one. And then, but I like a lot of Democrats of the next wave that are coming up. I think I like Sherrod Brown of Ohio. I think he's important to keep in the game and in place. Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, holding in the Midwest, and she's been talking a lot on environmental issues. Senator Markey, he's not going to be president, but Markey's an amazing environmental. I think he's probably the leader, Markey, on the environment in the U.S. Senate right now. There are others, Washington and Oregon. Incidentally, guys, Oregon's always very interesting. A lot of this stuff percolates out of Vermont and Oregon. I was amazed to find because they're smaller, they come up with unusual ideas and things, a different way to try things out. And so it's, but we're there, we'll get there. I think the leaders will come, but we're now in a Biden-Trump scenario, probably. And maybe not, who knows, I'm not a crystal ball reader, but that's going to be another fight right around the middle with this electoral college advantage Republicans have. Democrats have popular vote advantage. It's older generation, Trump, Biden. And so I'm waiting the next wave. Hopefully there'll be younger people representing us. Yeah, George?
This will sound strange given there's comments about atomic weapons. But do you see any role for safe nuclear power in the future?
Well, what a big question. Giant question. The nuclear energy question I find to be one of the largest ones because it would solve a lot of problems quickly. In the 60s, what happened was the big movement that Pacific Electric in California tried to build the biggest atomic campus on Bodega Bay, California, on the San Andreas Fault. You could not have picked a worse location to have sold, which was this massive compound. Well, that just fed the fundraising of the Sierra Club, and eventually Udall came out there, and they folk singers and the San Francisco Examiner, Chronicle, and they shut that down. And there are a lot of fear tactics about it, And anytime we have a nuclear disaster, a 3 Mile Island or Fukushima, it sets the nuclear energy narrative backwards. And so the question is, I feel the nuclear energy industry needs to do a massive advertising campaign to tell people why the technology is safer today, how it can be done. If you talk to those people, they just say, oh, I can't believe people are so stupid. We just should do nuclear power. It's like, no, there's fear, and you can't cover up the fear. People don't want to live next to a nuclear power plant because they're worried about it. And if you're saying it's safe, you're going to have to spend some more money to win over enough Americans. But I think we're probably going to be headed more in that direction, not on the San Andreas Fault, not everywhere, but there'll be, when I wrote on Theodore Roosevelt, Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee asked me to meet him, and he loves the Smoky Mountains, just loves it, but he did not want a wind farm in the Smokies. And he said, you love parks, you'll ruin the vistas of the Smoky Mountains. Can't we do one nuclear plant in downtown Knoxville that would eat up a square block and would provide all the power we need? So there's smart people in the nuclear world, but it's like this right now, how that's going to play out.
As a rabbi, I can't say this to my congregation, but here, there are just so many of us now recognizing the prospects of a possible Trump candidacy and even presidency, who just feel that we're deluding ourselves into believing that the things you're talking about, which are so essential to us, really have any chance of gaining ground. We're living at a time when people, it's not just the cynicism, but we're talking about people who, where the schism is so great. Half the country has no interest in this. How do we speak, and how do we express a voice that will be convincing to half a population of the country who has no concern?
we have to mobilize and we have to win. You can't let the nefarious forces take over. It's an old good and evil battle going on. But and I worried about part of the environmental disaster motif, like Hawaii happens. Oh my God, it's a doomsday a lot. What David Brower of the Sierra Club, great Sierra Club leader, used to say, we had fun in the 60s, 70s. We're going to have fun saving the planet. Mobilize young people. We're going to do it. We're going to go door to door. We're going to get out there. We're going to do the too much pessimism that we're doomed. And it's not, we got to run on optimism, and, John F. Kennedy's thing of, serving our country. We need to serve the planet now. We got to get out there and save the waterway. I need, my friend, Matt Malone, and Rabbi yourself, we need a spiritual awakening. Well, what we're doing is not right. We're being greedy and destroying, the planet at a unacceptable rapid pace due to modernity, and it's frightening. And yet we have to also believe that science can be our friend here, that we're going to find ways to divert water, desalination. John F. Kennedy was all about desalination of water, fresh water and all, but I can't lie. It's if Trump got in my opinion, we're in trouble, because it means the public, we lost our democratic spirit, that it's now a country about greed and individual, promotion of self to the degree that there's no collective caring anymore. And if you have money, I suppose you can find some place where the water's not polluted, but a lot of people are just going to be living in a ravaged planet. I don't even want to think about India, what's happening in West Africa. You're talking about really serious things. So I've been impressed by Pope Francis and the Pope's, promotion and talking honestly and earnestly about climate change to his congregation. Okay.
Okay, I have two questions. First of all, on the nuclear issue, shortly after, about 6 months after September 11th, I was living in Mount Kisco, New York, so very close to a nuclear power plant. And my brother rented a private plane from our local airport, Westchester, and flew like 100 yards over that nuclear power plant. So he was just trying to show that a terrorist with a kind of a small bomb could destroy New York City. And so that, I always think about that image when people say, but nuclear power can now be saved. So I just wonder if you know anything about what do they do in a situation like that. But aside from that, who are the historians you turn to? Who do you think is a great writer? Who's writing now? What's the future of history for our country or for our world? Who do you think is great?
Thank you, Carrie. On the first one, good point. One of the reasons these become targets. You have a nuclear power plant, and if we're ever in a war with China, they just are immediate targets. And that brings a lot of fear. You're putting a poster on, here's a nuclear plant. You want to have maximum disaster, hit that. And so, yes, it's a problem. And I don't think public feels the safety aspect of a missile targeting those places. You become a bullseye suddenly. On the historians front, there's so many I like, that you just gave the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award to Pennell Joseph, who writes a lot, wrote a book on Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, but also on the Black Reconstruction, on Black Power. He's really good and talented on race. A lot's going on in the world, in the academic world right now, on presidents. I'm in a boom business, presidential history now. It's like people are like, how did we get Trump? Please tell us, and it's like all the other presidents, and then there's Trump. But environmental history is a big field now. A lot of people are starting to write and say. A man named William Cronin, who's at Yale, I like a lot, as a modern historian on the environment. There's the I've always loved the great narrative writers, I grew up with, but David McCullough, who died recently, was a great friend of mine and a mentor of sorts. And I wrote about him when he passed, the Washington Post. But I think gender studies, people writing about women, I mean, that whole 1619 project, whatever you think about how its thrust is really opening us, rethinking of race, gender, history in new ways. So it's forced me to, for example, I'm looking on the environmental field of George Washington Carver, who was thought of as the Tuskegee guy of Peanuts and Black history, but actually was preaching organic farming, not how to use compost. Henry Ford brought him up for soybean growing. All these things that George Washington Carver had thought up in the 20s and 30s is now really relevant to thinking about how we do new agriculture. So it's a constant discovery of people. It
was very good.
But there's been a number of good books on your family that I like recently. From Fred at Harvard, Alongville, I think did a good one volume, and we still need. I was mentored a lot by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and I miss him. It's very hard to be that good of a writer. Now, he wrote so beautifully, and very few do. Doris Kearns Goodwin is here in Boston, and she's writing her memoir right now about the 60s. She's at the point in her life that she's in the memoir mode, not the big new history. But her Team of Rivals book on Lincoln is a masterpiece of historical scholarship that's both academic and popular, both. The Bully Pulpit on Theodore Roosevelt, I admire of hers a lot. Meaning, you guys know what the Library of America is? There's these black volumes of great. Very few historians will make that. A couple of Doris's books probably will. There aren't many active ones, but there's a new biography of Martin Luther King out. I recommend by Jonathan Eig. It's really good. Just called King, I believe, but I'd read it if you can. It's just out a couple months ago. Anyone else?
I think I'd like to wrap it up.
All right. Thank you, guys.
I'm going to paraphrase President Kennedy, who said, anything that humans do, whether it's good or bad, we can solve it. We as humans have the power to overcome the problems that maybe we create. So I'm going to take that as a leap of faith. And thank you for the Kennedy family. And thank you for Senator Kirk for being here. Thank you all. So we will do a book signing, and there are refreshments on the lower level. Please come in and visit our galleries and continue the conversation. Thank you.